A man can be destroyed but not defeated, unless he defeats himself emotionally. Schopenhauer didn't talk about emotional weakness the way modern culture does. For him, emotion wasn't weakness, but unchecked emotion was. When a man lets emotional chaos define his identity, his relationships begin to rot from the inside. And while many men think vulnerability earns them connection, Schopenhauer warns, without structure, vulnerability turns to collapse, and collapse turns into lost respect. You don't lose her love the day you cry. You lose her when you fall apart without knowing how to rebuild. The problem isn't feeling, it's depending on others to carry what you refuse to master yourself. In this video, we'll explore Schopenhauer's raw, unfiltered analysis of emotional weakness in relationships. You'll learn why expressing your pain doesn't always bring you closer, how men unintentionally destroy connection by becoming emotionally dependent, and how to transform pain into presence without losing your center. Subscribe if you're ready to turn emotional chaos into grounded strength. Like and stay with us if you want to stop being emotionally fragile and start becoming emotionally clean. Schopenhauer didn't see emotional pain as something to be hidden, but he also didn't glorify emotional collapse. In his philosophy, suffering is inevitable, but indulgence in suffering is a choice. That distinction is key when we talk about emotional weakness in men. There's a difference between a man who feels deeply and a man who falls apart every time pressure builds. One learns to stand inside the storm, the other expects to be rescued from it, and over time, women stop trusting the man who collapses. Because he teaches them. When life hits hard, he won't be standing beside them, he'll be waiting to be picked up. Emotional weakness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the man who overshares too early, mistaking openness for bonding. Sometimes it's the man who breaks down not to be seen, but to be carried. And sometimes it's the man who lives in cycles of confession and regret. Always. Processing, never changing. Schopenhauer warned of this type of man, one ruled not by reason or willpower, but by waves of feeling he refuses to discipline. That kind of emotional exposure doesn't earn trust, it erodes it. Because over time, it stops looking like honesty and starts looking like instability. What many men miss is that emotional weakness isn't about crying, it's about collapse without recovery. Vulnerability, when structured, builds intimacy. But collapse, when repeated, breeds resentment. Women may offer empathy at first, but if a man repeatedly spirals, seeks reassurance, and becomes emotionally dependent, what began as connection turns into burden. Schopenhauer believed the will must be examined and observed, and a man who refuses to observe his emotional tendencies becomes a slave to them, losing his own power and losing her respect. Respect is the currency of polarity. It's what allows attraction to survive challenge. And once respect is lost, desire soon follows. A woman may care for a man who is emotionally weak, but she will not crave him. Because craving requires containment. It requires the man to have internal boundaries, an emotional spine. And Schopenhauer, though deeply aware of life's suffering, also insisted on the discipline of detachment. A man who detaches from his reactive patterns doesn't become cold, he becomes steady. He becomes someone who can lead himself and therefore be trusted by others. This steadiness is what emotional strength actually looks like, not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain dictate behavior. It's the man who feels fear but doesn't flinch, who feels sorrow but doesn't seek to be mothered through it, who feels doubt but doesn't weaponize it in the relationship. Emotional strength is not about suppression, it's about self-possession. And a man who possesses himself emotionally becomes a rare and powerful presence. But before that presence can emerge, the collapse must be named. The man must see that every time he melts down hoping for relief, he is slowly training others, especially his partner, to carry what he won't. That's not intimacy, that's emotional outsourcing. And the first step toward breaking it is not controlling the emotion, it's confronting the pattern. Schopenhauer said we are often the source of our own torment, and when a man sees this clearly, he doesn't harden, he matures. When a man uses emotional openness to seek rescue, instead of resolution, he enters a subtle form of emotional dependency that Schopenhauer would label as unconscious servitude to the will. He wants relief from his pain, but instead of building internal tools to process it, he begins relying on his partner for emotional stabilization. This might look like venting too often, seeking constant reassurance, or turning every difficult moment into a personal crisis. And at first, the woman may respond with care, but it's not sustainable, because eventually she stops feeling like a partner and starts feeling like a therapist. And nothing kills attraction faster than being needed to manage someone else's unprocessed life. What feels like vulnerability to the man often feels like weight to the woman, not because she lacks empathy, but because she begins to see a pattern. This man isn't trying to get stronger, he's outsourcing his strength. Schopenhauer's view of human nature makes this even more sobering. People grow weary of those who suffer loudly, but refuse to change quietly. Emotional dependency drains the relationship, not because the emotion is too much, but because the responsibility for it is misdirected. He's not asking for connection, he's asking for containment. And the moment she senses that, respect begins to erode. This erosion is rarely verbalized. It happens in silence, in small shifts. Her tone flattens, her eyes lose depth. Her attraction fades not because he's emotional, but because she no longer sees him as stable. And women don't desire what they don't trust. Schopenhauer would argue that suffering without reflection becomes indulgence. And when a man uses his pain as a permanent pass for weakness, he invites pity, not polarity. A man who collapses into his emotion and stays there teaches others to see him not as strong, but as fragile, and fragility, unbalanced, repels more. Then it connects. Some men think that if they show their brokenness, it proves their depth. But depth isn't the ability to fall apart. It's the ability to feel fully without fragmenting. True emotional depth includes recovery. It includes stillness. It includes the capacity to suffer with dignity. Schopenhauer spoke often of the nobility of enduring suffering with composure, not to suppress it, but to carry it without infecting others. A man who knows how to bleed without making a mess becomes admirable. A man who turns every cut into a spectacle becomes exhausting. The hidden cost of emotional weakness is the destruction of leadership, personal and relational. When a man is ruled by emotion, he can't lead his own life, much less a relationship. He waits for her cues. He overreacts to her shifts. He interprets every silence as rejection, and instead of anchoring the connection, he becomes the wave. She adapts to him, not because she wants to, but because he refuses to anchor himself. Schopenhauer might say, he forfeits his agency by surrendering to every emotional storm. And slowly he becomes invisible, not because he lacks presence, but because he refuses to cultivate it. The solution is not emotional suppression, it's ownership. The man must recognize when he is no longer sharing emotion but dumping it, when he's no longer seeking connection but escape, when he's no longer being seen but seeking to be saved. Schopenhauer's remedy begins here. Observe the will. See your impulse to collapse not as your truth, but as your pattern. And once it becomes visible, it can be challenged, not erased, but carried with strength, with dignity, and with enough silence to be heard. Modern advice often tells men to open up, express their feelings, and be vulnerable. And while there's truth in that, Schopenhauer would caution, expression without containment is not strength, it's spillage. The man who believes that emotional openness alone earns intimacy is missing the deeper structure. Vulnerability is powerful when it's clean, when it's offered with clarity, not as a cry for rescue. But when expression becomes uncontrolled discharge, it does not create intimacy. It creates emotional confusion, and confusion is the birthplace of disconnection. The man thinks he's being honest. He thinks saying everything he feels is courageous, but often it's the opposite. It's avoidance of internal mastery. It's using others to process what he refuses to sit with alone. Schopenhauer might say he's not expressing truth, he's escaping responsibility. And while a partner might initially appreciate the rawness, over time she realizes he doesn't want to grow through this, he wants to collapse in it. She sees the pattern and silently pulls back, not because she's cold, but because her nervous system no longer feels safe. Safety isn't just physical, it's emotional. And when a man constantly destabilizes the emotional space, he becomes unsafe to rely on. This doesn't mean a man can't cry or share his battles. It means he must bring structure to it. Emotional leadership means saying, "I'm struggling and I'm doing the work," not, "I'm struggling and I need you to fix me." Schopenhauer wrote that people become burdens when they give up the fight to carry themselves. When a man gives up that fight, he asks his partner to carry not just his emotions but his identity. This slowly turns connection into caretaking, and caretaking is where polarity dies. She becomes cautious with her words, fears his next emotional wave, and adapts her energy to stabilize him. Over time, this dynamic flips the relationship. She becomes the ground, he becomes the storm. And storms, no matter how intense, are not trusted to lead. Schopenhauer would say the illusion of strength without inner order breeds false intimacy. What begins as vulnerability ends as volatility. True emotional strength doesn't suppress pain. It organizes it. It holds the space without making it a spectacle. It says, "I am shaken, but I am still standing." That steadiness doesn't come from denial. It comes from discipline. It comes from self-awareness. It comes from the decision not to perform your feelings, but to feel them fully without losing yourself. And Schopenhauer's philosophy centers around this exact principle. Endurance without theatrics, stillness without detachment, feeling without drowning. The man who stops confusing expression with strength begins to mature emotionally. He stops demanding that others hold his storm and starts learning to stand inside it. His vulnerability becomes selective, intentional, and meaningful. And that's when it becomes attractive, not because it's pretty, but because it's clean. And in a world full of emotional noise, a man with clean emotional signal becomes unforgettable, not because he's loud, but because he's clear. There's a brutal moment many men face in relationships, the first time they break down emotionally in front of a woman and she pulls away. It feels like betrayal. He opened his heart, showed his pain, became vulnerable, and, instead of drawing closer, she became colder, quieter, or distant. But Schopenhauer would say this reaction isn't cruelty, it's instinct. Because while love creates care, attraction responds to strength, and when a man completely collapses, not once, but repeatedly, he signals to her nervous system, "You're on your own now." And she adapts, not out of choice, but out of survival. Women withdraw not because they don't care, but because they can't rely on a man who emotionally disintegrates. That withdrawal is often subconscious. Her body tightens. Her tone changes. Her desire dulls. Why? Because now she's managing him. She's gauging his emotional spikes. She's wondering if he'll spiral again. And suddenly the relationship isn't about growth, it's about stability control. Schopenhauer's framework on human suffering applies perfectly here. When one person becomes the container for another's chaos, they suffer, not from cruelty but from emotional overload. What the man interprets as rejection is often a reaction to his own lack of grounding. Emotional weight, when held briefly, can bond. But when it becomes consistent, it breaks the connection. Because love is not unconditional emotional labor. It's chosen emotional intimacy. And when one person is always holding space for the other's breakdowns eventually, that space closes. Schopenhauer would say respect collapses when responsibility is abandoned. And in romantic dynamics, respect is oxygen. This isn't about never being vulnerable. It's about knowing when your vulnerability is an invitation and when it's a weight. It's about building emotional honesty that empowers rather than disables. A man who shares his heart without collapsing into it becomes magnetic. A man who shares pain with structure becomes trustworthy. Because now she's not carrying him, she's walking with him. And that's when polarity thrives, when both are walking, neither dragging the other. The man who ignores this lesson repeats the pattern. Every time he enters a new relationship, he promises to be real. He shares early. He opens too much. He breaks down. And again, she pulls away. He blames her. He thinks women want cold men. But what Schopenhauer would argue is that women don't want coldness, they want containment. Not emotional voids, but emotional leadership. And if a man can't carry himself, no one else should be asked to do it for him. To shift this pattern, a man must begin by reclaiming his weight. He must stop asking others to stabilize what he refuses to anchor. He must stop bleeding to be seen and start healing in silence. He must stop measuring connection by how much he shares and start measuring it by how much he can carry without collapsing. Schopenhauer's answer isn't to shut down emotion, it's to master it. Not through suppression, but through sovereignty. And sovereignty is what makes love sustainable and a man unforgettable. Schopenhauer teaches that life is suffering, but the wise man doesn't beg to be spared from it. He learns to endure it without illusion. Emotional weakness is born when a man tries to turn pain into currency, when he hopes that his struggle will buy him connection, sympathy, or rescue. But emotional authority begins when he no longer tries to be saved, when he stops pleading through his breakdown and starts standing through it. The moment a man stops using emotion to be seen and starts using it to see himself, that's when transformation begins. Emotional authority isn't about suppression, it's about precision. It's the difference between dumping and communicating, between reacting and reflecting. A man who possesses emotional authority doesn't deny his pain, but he doesn't weaponize it either. He shares from clarity, not chaos. He doesn't test his partner's love by collapsing. He builds her trust by carrying himself even when he's cracked open. And Schopenhauer's principle of self-mastery applies here perfectly. It's not about escaping the will, but understanding it so deeply that it no longer rules you. That man is rare. Because he doesn't seek pity, he earns respect. He doesn't need saving, he invites closeness. And that's what makes him attractive, not his perfection, but his presence. He can break, but he rebuilds. He can cry, but he never hands over his strength. He can feel everything, but remains rooted in something deeper than emotion, his commitment to integrity. Emotional weakness flinches, folds, and waits. Emotional authority breathes, anchors, and leads. This kind of man changes how women relate to him. They stop managing him. They start respecting him. They stop pulling back. They start leaning in, because now she can feel safe in his storm, not because the storm disappeared, but because he stopped trying to throw it at her. Schopenhauer would say this is clarity made visible. And clarity in a world full of emotional noise feels like peace. A man who provides peace is a man who doesn't just inspire love, he commands it. This doesn't mean the man becomes stoic, to the point of detachment. It means his depth is grounded in discipline. He doesn't rush to spill everything. He doesn't treat his partner like a container for every passing emotion. He filters before he speaks. He breathes before he reacts. He walks into intimacy not as a burden, but as a builder. And this shift, from emotional fragility to emotional authority, doesn't just change his relationships, it redefines his entire identity. Because now, he's no longer ruled by feelings, he's informed by them. He's no longer afraid to hurt, but refuses to act from the hurt. He's no longer collapsing, craving to be carried. He's leading, with strength, with softness, and with the kind of presence that doesn't break when pressure hits. That's not coldness, that's clarity, that's not detachment, that's depth. And that's the man who no longer loses her. When he opens his heart, because this time he didn't shatter, he stood. You thought opening up would bring you closer. You thought being raw would make her stay. You thought showing your pain would prove your depth. But here's the truth. She didn't pull away because you cried. She pulled away because you collapsed. And the difference is everything. Schopenhauer saw it with brutal clarity. Emotion without structure doesn't build intimacy. It builds instability. And no woman wants to build a life on ground that shakes every time it rains. What you called vulnerability was sometimes just emotional leakage. What you called honesty was often a silent plea to be saved. And what you thought would prove your worth only reminded her that you still haven't learned to carry it. Because when you depend on a woman to hold your emotions for you, she doesn't feel connected. She feels trapped. Not by your feelings, but by your refusal to lead yourself through them. But here's what Schopenhauer would offer you: clarity. He wouldn't tell you to hide your pain. He'd tell you to own it, to stand inside it, to suffer consciously, not to perform your struggle, but to master it, because emotional pain is not weakness. Collapsing in it is. And once you see that clearly, you stop handing your emotional weight to others and start carrying it like a man. And when you do, everything changes. You stop losing respect every time you open your heart. Because now that heart doesn't come with chaos. It comes with calm. It comes with courage. It comes with the kind of presence that makes a woman lean in instead of pull away. And it's not because she pities you. It's because she finally feels safe with you, not because you're numb, but because you're stable. So stop telling yourself that she couldn't handle your feelings. Start asking yourself if you handled them before handing them to her. Stop believing that emotional collapse is a pathway to closeness. Start realizing that emotional containment is what allows closeness to exist. You don't need to become hard. You need to become grounded. You don't need to feel less. You need to stop making your feelings someone else's responsibility. If this video hit you in the chest, it's because you already knew the truth, you just didn't have the words. So here they are. Your emotions aren't too much, but your lack of discipline around them might be, and that can change. Not with performance, but with presence. Not with apology, but with awareness. Not with silence, but with structure. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to stop being emotionally fragile and start becoming emotionally clean. Hit like if you know it's time to lead yourself before asking anyone else to trust you. And share this video with a man who's been confusing emotional weight with emotional strength. This isn't about being cold. It's about being clear. Because when you're clear, you don't lose her when you open your heart. You become the one she finally feels safe opening hers to.